GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight.
When you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism.
The Israeli government has launched a scathing attack on the Socialist Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, after he appeared to excuse the October the 7th attacks on Israel, claiming they didn't take place in a vacuum. Are the cracks beginning to show in the Labour Party over the question of support for Israel? It's been a busy 24 hours for the leader of the opposition after he visited a mosque in Wales and was accused of misrepresenting the visit. He subsequently met Muslim MPs earlier today to assuage the backlash over his strong and decent support for Israel. Yesterday was the one-year anniversary of the Prime Minister becoming leader of the Conservative Party. Today is the anniversary of his kissing hands and becoming Prime Minister. He's rolled back green policies, he's slowly made use of Brexit benefits, and he's been cutting costs. But the question is, will he cut taxes and win the next election? And it just so happens that the Prime Minister's appointment coincides with the anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt. St Crispionis' Day is upon us, and it'd be a lesson for the Prime Minister that he ought to take inspiration from Henry V's heroism rather than Henry VI's absence and apathy. Plus, it's good news for tea and coffee drinkers. A new study has suggested 4 cups a day could be crucial to a life of longevity, health and happiness. I've just finished my 7th. I've actually got my 8th in front of me for the day, so I might go on and on. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by a pugnacious panel this evening, the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the PR tycoon and former Labour councillor, Kevin Craig. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, what you've all been waiting for, the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, the top story from the GB newsroom tonight is that the BBC boss, Tim Davie, has faced an unprecedented grilling from MPs over the broadcaster's failure to label Hamas as a terrorist organisation. Conservative MPs are understood to have become increasingly concerned over the BBC's coverage of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Today's meeting was requested by the 1922 committee, which represents Conservative backbenchers. Tory MP Jonathan Gullis spoke to GB News after the meeting, saying he was shocked that Tim Davie would not agree to calling Hamas terrorists because it may hurt some people's feelings.
To me, this is mind-boggling. Everyone knows that Hamas is a terrorist organisation. It's a prescribed terrorist organisation here in this country. Every other news agency, like the great GB News, also considers this to be a terrorist organisation. What on earth the Director General thinks is going on, I don't know, but he is so far out of touch with the people of this great country, and particularly the Jewish community, not just here but around the world. He's brought shame upon this institution and has made the case why now more than ever the British taxpayer should have to continue paying the telly tax.
Well, Israel's Prime Minister, in the meantime, says all Hamas fighters are doomed. as he warns his country is now preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu refused to give details of the planned offensive, but again urged Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to evacuate to the south of the country. Israel has reportedly agreed to delay its ground invasion to allow the US to place missile defence systems around their assets in the Middle East. Meanwhile, here the Prime Minister is refusing to support calls for a ceasefire despite pressure from more than 80 MPs to do so. Instead, Rishi Sunak is backing what he calls specific pauses in the conflict to allow for the safe delivery of aid to the territory. 5 British people are still among more than 200 still being held hostage in Gaza. Politics, and Peter Bone has been suspended from the House of Commons for 6 weeks over bullying and sexual misconduct of a staff member. The Wellingborough MP, who denies the allegations, has already been expelled from the Tory party. And that means another by-election is looming now for Rishi Sunak, as a call petition will be arranged. A campaign against anti-Semitism demonstrations has taken place in New Scotland Yard in London. Hundreds gathered outside the police headquarters to protest against the National March for Palestine planned for this Saturday in London. The group has written to the Metropolitan Police asking that appropriate conditions be imposed on the march. They're calling on New Scotland Yard for the law to be upheld, saying make arrests, not excuses. A former South Wales police officer has been jailed for life with a minimum term to serve of 12 years for sexual offences against children. Lewis Edwards used fake social media accounts and posed as a teenager to groom more than 200 young girls online. He forced his victims to take indecent videos and images of themselves, then using the material to blackmail them. In sentencing, the judge described his behaviour as cruel and sadistic. And lastly, Anne Diamond has been made an OBE at Buckingham Palace today. The journalist and GB News presenter received the honour from His Majesty King Charles for her services to public health and charity. It recognised her campaigning efforts for research into cot death following the death of her own son, Sebastian, from sudden infant death syndrome. She's called the moment a crowning achievement to everyone who helped her campaign. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
The Socialist Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, a rather undiplomatic diplomat, had this to say at the UN yesterday.
It is important to also recognise the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
In response, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, said this.
But the UN is failing. The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism.
The UN Secretary-General comments about the genocidal act of terrorism on the 7th of October seem to justify it in some way. And whilst his response is somewhat cryptic, others have been even more explicit about this. Take, for example, Latifa Abu-Shakara, the woman ITV News interviewed regarding Islamophobia, who told the channel, "It makes me feel as a Muslim woman in this country that no matter how hard I work, no matter how good I can be, it will never be enough because apparently Muslims and Palestinians are inherently terrorists." It later emerged she is actually a reporter for the Iranian state-funded press TV broadcaster, as exposed by GB News' very own Charlie Peters, and she actually had this to say about the recent attacks on Israel.
Nothing will ever be able to take back this moment of triumph, this moment of resistance, this moment of surprise, this moment of humiliation on behalf of the Zionist entity.
How could she say this moment of triumph, this moment of resistance? What an appalling thing to say, and no wonder ITV subsequently apologised. And we saw this happen in New York yesterday at a pro-Palestinian rally.
Resistance is justified! Resistance is justified! When people are occupied! When people are occupied! Resistance is justified! Resistance is justified! When people are occupied! When people are occupied!
Resistance is justified if people are occupied. What awful nonsense is this? That acts of evil, beheading babies, is not justified by anything. And the fact that the Gaza hadn't been occupied in nearly 20 years didn't seem to bother these protesters. Now, bubbling under the surface of this movement is something sinister. While they talk of supporting innocent Palestinians, all too often they appear to go further to justify murdering 1,400 innocent people as a legitimate act of resistance. And it's this that has got the Secretary-General of the United Nations into trouble, because he has got his fingers too close to this really appalling view of the world, this idea that seems to think that what Hamas has done is something to be accepted or even celebrated, rather than to be unequivocally condemned or is even in any way justified, because to endorse or make excuses for Hamas is not only glorification of terrorism, it's also desperately unfair on the decent Palestinians living in Palestine who do not support Hamas, but who get portrayed as being represented by Hamas by the type of people who buy into the Secretary-General's phraseology. And if Hamas were truly to represent Palestinians, then there's no hope for peace in this conflict. So for the UN Secretary-General, who was, of course, a former leader of the Socialist International, Antonio Guterres, to echo this sort of rhetoric is worse than improper. And it's worse than showing the impotence of the United Nations. It is a real failure of leadership. He's meant to be a diplomat. He's not meant to be somebody who's making the problem worse. No wonder the Israelis have called for him to go. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts via mailmog@gbnews.com. But joining me now is Professor Ashok Swain of the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. Well, Professor, thank you very much for joining me. This was clearly a blunder by the Secretary-General of the United Nations, who is meant to be diplomatic, wasn't it? He can't start talking about 56 years of occupation and things like that without appear to be justifying terrorism.
Thank you for having me. And I'm afraid he is not wrong. I think he has told what a Secretary-General should say, because for a long time, I think we have been hiding what exactly the problem is. It's, of course, what has happened on 7th of October. He didn't condone it. He condemned it. There was nothing that he was ever justifying it, but he was also putting the problem in perspective. And he is the Secretary General. His job is to bringing a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And I think that's his job. And I don't think I think he was completely misunderstood. Or a country like Israel, which has been born because of the United Nations, has this kind of attitude to the United Nations and its representative like Secretary General. It's actually terrible.
But isn't it rather difficult when the Secretary General says things that appear to say that you will get violence if certain conditions are fulfilled? And that's the implication of what he was saying, which isn't true, because there are people who suffer under much worse regimes than anything the Israelis have ever done, who don't resort to violence and certainly don't slaughter babies, and that he has opened himself up to this accusation from Israel by careless speech, really.
No, I don't. I think it is. It's actually Israel has a tendency not to be criticized for its action, and I think it has taken it for granted that whatever it does, nobody will have the guts to criticize it. And I think that has been a problem. The problem is that we need a long-term solution of this conflict. Nobody, no sensible mind will be anyway justifying any terror activity or anyone who is killing any civilian. I mean, there is no way anyone can justify that. But that doesn't mean that the conflict is actually on because of the 7th of October incident. The conflict is actually... sorry, please go ahead.
Well, no, thank you. I was just going to say that, yes, of course it's important to understand what the tensions are between Israel and Palestine, what the issues are, and the solutions that have been discussed and proposed. And you charitably say of the Secretary-General of the UN that his words have been quoted out of context or have been misconstrued. But actually, if you're a diplomat, it's your job to speak in such a way that your words in such a sensitive matter can't be misconstrued.
Well, I think we have seen too much of diplomacy or diplomatic language on this issue, and too much of somehow restrained or somehow taking this thing which is going on in the Middle East for so many years. And I think he has done the right thing, because with which many countries, particularly in Europe and North America, are afraid of saying this thing, because this is very, very important. That this is what has happened on 7th of October. And even if the Israel, with getting the right to defend, it cannot kill 2.3 million people on Gaza. Even if it kills, the conflict is not going to solve. So the conflict needs to be looked at the long-term perspective and how to find a lasting solution. Who else will do that if the UN Secretary General will not come forward, say exactly where the problem is? If you don't really look at the problem, you don't accept the problem, then you will never find the solution. And I think this is where the diplomat is. He's of course a chief diplomat, but he is also UN Secretary General. And we want, at this point of time, when the world is going through so many crises, we want him to take the leadership role. And I think this is where I see it, that what he has done, it is absolutely the right thing to do, to really tell the world that what exactly the problem is and why we need to find a long-term solution.
Well, yes, nobody would deny that the effort to find a long-term solution is very important. But as what you might call the world's most important diplomat, isn't it important that he doesn't alienate by essentially misspeaking, by saying something in a way that was open to the interpretation that he was justifying the attack, and therefore alienating Israel, makes it harder for him to do his job and to bring people together, because from an Israeli point of view, he's not competent to do that. He seems to have been taking not only sides, but to have taken a side that is sympathetic or justifies terrorism.
I think I understand the present government or present regime in Israel. Of course, that is the voice. But of course, there has been a large number of Israelis do not really subscribe or do not support what is going on or what is being done by the Netanyahu government. So I think it is somehow, it is not exactly, when we brand it that it's the Israelis' voice or all the Jews are saying this, that's actually wrong. Because Israel, a large number of Israelis are not supporting of the kind of actions which is Netanyahu regime is doing in Gaza. So I think, we need to look at, of course, I do agree that, it's the legitimate regime. You can say that's what which is in power. But of course, at the same time, it is important for Israel to know that they cannot do whatever they think they can do. So because there are restrictions, there are international law, there are international norms, they are not beyond that. They are supposed to know that this, because their existence is actually with the support, with the strength of the United Nations. And the United Nations is actually draws it, because all the countries need to respect it. You cannot disrespect this way because you don't like a statement of the UN Secretary General. You can call him whatever you want to. The languages are being used in Israel. It's absolutely horrific against him. So I think we need to be very, very careful not to tarnish his image.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but thank you for your time. We've run out of time, but thank you, Professor Ashok. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up next, could the Israeli-Palestine issue be causing cracks in the Labour Party as Keir Starmer has to defend his position on Israel's self-defence? Plus, is Rishi Sunak a Henry V or Henry VI?
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time! Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
Oh!
No, thank you. My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you guessed it, this is still State of the Nation, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. David, the UN has become irrelevant. It no longer attempts to uphold the aspirations of its founders after World War II. And Heather, this man, the UN Secretary-General, is a disgrace following the horrific massacres. He should be removed from this overpaid job immediately. Sir Keir Starmer has rightly earned much praise on the issue of anti-Semitism. Though his predecessors' troubling views on Israel weren't enough for Sir Keir to leave the shadow cabinet, there's no doubt that he has took a hard stance on anti-Semitism in his party, and he has now created a space where many Jewish Labour members feel welcome again, including people like Luciana Berger. However, the cracks in the Labour Party are beginning to show once again on the question of the Israel-Palestine debate. Not long after the 7th of October attacks, Sir Keir gave an interview in which he appeared clearly to support Israel's right to self-defence, including cutting off the water supply to Gaza. And as a result, more than 20 Labour councillors resigned. This was compounded by his visit to a mosque in South Wales, in which the mosque leadership accused him of misrepresenting the visit, as well as his crunch talks with Labour Muslim legislators earlier today. Could there be a re-emergence of an old rift in the party? Well, I'm now joined by the Imam and broadcaster, Amjad Masroor. Thank you very much for joining me. What do you think the difficulty is for Sir Keir Starmer, and how would you advise him if he asked for your counsel?
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, very simply, he is a leader of the opposition and hopefully becoming the next Prime Minister as he wishes, as he has been campaigning for a long period. He would represent all communities, Muslims, non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, people of faith and no faith. On this particular occasion, when it comes to Israel and Palestinian conflict, he unfortunately has sided just one side. He has ignored the plight of the Palestinians who have lived under occupation for more than 75 years. He has said Israel has every right to defend itself. Of course, he's right. So do the Palestinians have a right to resist occupation, demolishing of their homes and destruction of their properties. He didn't say that about the Palestinians. He talked about Israeli life as very valuable, and we agree. Every life is valuable. But he didn't say the same thing about the Palestinians. The babies in Palestine, more than half of those who've been killed, of the 5,000 people since the bombing began, have been babies. Keir Starmer did not stand up to defend those babies. And
Look,
worst of all...
it's a little bit odd for me to be defending the leader of the Labour Party as a Conservative politician, but I think you're being extremely unfair on the leader of the opposition, who has made it clear that he is against a terrorist attack and believes that a country can respond to protect itself from terrorism, and that he has encouraged Israel to allow aid to go through. He has encouraged Israel to be careful in its response. He's been balanced in that approach whilst accepting the fundamental principle of self-defence. Surely that's fair and right. And that's not anti the Palestinians, it's anti-Hamas.
I think the concept of self-defense is enshrined in all laws, I agree. But also, right to resist occupation is also within our conventions, international treaties. Geneva Convention gives the Palestinian every right to defend themselves and resist the occupation. Remember, Israel has occupied Palestinian territory for more than 75 years.
But not as it happens Gaza. But I think we need to be clear on this.
Hold on a second.
Gaza isn't itself occupied, is it? It is an independent territory that unfortunately is run by Hamas.
That's not true. It's not independent territory. It's controlled, it's airspace, it's land space, it's sea space. We can see it from the current blockade. The country or the people of that particular prison.
It's controlled because terrorist attacks were launched from it. That's why the Israelis built a wall. They didn't do that initially, but they did it because suicide bombers were coming through.
Rees-Mogg, if you don't allow me to complete my sentence, you can throw me lots of questions and I won't be able to answer any of them. Please give me the chance to complete my answer.
You've got the time. Answer away.
The previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, said Gaza is the biggest open prison in the world. That's your party leader, former leader, that is. Why? It's because Gaza is being controlled by Israel. It is the occupying force. And international law says an occupying force has responsibility over the people it governs or it occupies. Hamas is not a government. Our government has termed it a terrorist group. If it's a terrorist group, why would we punish collective punishment of more than 2.3 million people? Cutting off water, cutting off electricity, cutting off their food supply is war crime. And Keir Starmer, particularly here, has failed miserably to stand up, especially when he is supposed to be a qualified human rights lawyer. And of course, our own Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has blindly supported Israeli action. I support the rights of all people to defend themselves. I support the end of occupation. I support free people's rights so that people can live with dignity and honor. Unfortunately, both the party leaders have been blinded on one side, and that's what we're calling out for.
OK, well, I gave you plenty of time to respond. I think in many ways too much time. I'm now joined by my panel, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the successful PR tycoon and former Labour councillor, Kevin Craig. Kevin, I'm going to come to you first, because I thought what he said was just wrong, and that Sir Keir Starmer has got this right, which may be something you're surprised to hear me say.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear you say it, Jake, and I'm grateful that you did. I think that last gentleman, I'm pretty outraged, actually, by his characterisation of Sir Keir Starmer. I'll just go back a week to what Keir Starmer said long before the latest, the last 24 hours. In this time of grave crisis, Westminster must speak with one voice against terror, in support of Israel's right to self-defence, for the dignity of all human life, for humanitarian access to those suffering in Gaza, and to uphold the rule of international law. And the imam that was just on there now, you know, I will mention the absolute human tragedy of young babies dying under bomb buildings, but let us not forget the atrocities that led us to this point, which he didn't mention, OK? And I am angry about the experiences of Jewish people in this country in the last few weeks. And I stood next to Keir Starmer and all of the shadow cabinet at a Labour Friends of Israel reception at party conference just after all the atrocities had happened, and I was very proud of the response. It does not mean to be in solidarity with the Jewish people in the state of Israel, that Keir Starmer is not bothered by the appalling loss of life that has happened as a result of some of the bombing. This is the fault of Hamas.
Well, Kelvin, I actually think Starmer's been pretty statesmanlike over this. He's backed the Prime Minister. He has, as Kevin says, he's been absolutely clear that this is an act of terrorism and the right of self-defence is important. He's also expressed concern about what is happening in Palestine to innocent civilians who, as Kevin rightly says, are the victims of Hamas in the same way as people murdered directly by them are. But this leaves him with a difficulty in his party because there are large numbers of members of his party who are more Corbynista in this regard, and I think 150 councillors have criticised him, a number of MPs are very unhappy, and that is difficult for him in terms of his own party management.
No, he's got a divided house. There's no doubt about it. And if this develops into a ground force and Hezbollah and everything, don't even think about it. It's going to get worse and worse for Labour, and it will become more and more difficult for him to have a sticking plaster on this issue because it will start endangering them, I think, at the ballot box. And so, if you look at the way that the Muslim community appear to vote in this country, they vote almost exclusively for Labour. And in fact, I think if you look up and down the land, I think there's like 10 mayors now of various major cities. Birmingham, London is the one off the top of my head, Bradford, and etc. And so they are political. They are political. And they are not going to allow the leader of the Labour Party to have a view of which they don't agree, or that they will head out, I suspect, either to another party, or they will literally campaign on the streets against Sir Keir.
So, Kelvin, on this, I'm really sorry, I have to say, you know, the number of councillors that resigned is a fraction of the 6,000 plus Labour councillors across the country. And if anybody wants to leave the Labour Party because of the way that Keir Starmer has led the party and spoken, I think, for millions of people in the past few weeks, let them.
But, Kevin, you know as well as I do that if 150 councillors complain, that is a real problem because even though out of 6,000 it's not a huge percentage, you don't get councillors coming out in that way against their own party. It's extremely rare. Well, and it's an important sign of discontent within the party.
I think there is... You know, there is absolute concern, I mean, as there should be in the Parliamentary Labour Party, but as there is in the Parliamentary Conservative Party about world events and, of course, about the loss of innocent lives as a result of what Israel has had to do in response to Hamas's atrocities. But, Jacob, you know, I am more across the detail of the grassroots of the Labour Party maybe than anyone here.
Yeah.
And, you know, it is a small number of councillors. And the discussions today that were had with members of Parliament have apparently been very helpful. But Keir Starmer, I read out what he was saying a week ago, and he is, you know, I stood there. There is no issue with him understanding that what happened to Israel and Jewish people was an atrocity, and it has to be dealt with, whilst calling, like the President of the United States is, who, by the way, Hamas calls a fascist. Did you see that?
Yeah.
Hamas called Joe Biden a fascist, the President of the United States. I mean, this is who we're dealing with.
And do you think Kelvin is right, though, that this is an electoral problem potentially for Labour, or you think that it can be...
I mean, look, you know, I respect Kelvin's career and what he's done in the national media.
There had to be one.
Yeah, and you know he's held some very big jobs, but I don't share much of his analysis on this. You know,
Kelvin.
Well, let's see. Let's see as this develops into a more serious actual war, and find out whether people would say we find it difficult to vote for a party where a substantial minority appear to favour the Muslim community against the Jewish one.
Well, thank you both very much. Coming up next, it's the one-year anniversary of the Prime Minister's appointment, and I hope the first of many. But will he be remembered as Henry V or Henry VI? Plus, we'll be revelling in the English victory over the French at Agincourt on St Crispin's Day.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like? I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these 3.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Jean says, I was horrified by the UN Secretary-General's speech, which did seem to justify the Hamas attack, regardless of his comments since. His comments could have far-reaching negative effects at this very sensitive time. And Sally says Starmer faces an extremely tough situation, and I think it's important to recognise that. More than 25 Labour councillors resigning is not a good look with an election looming, but it's difficult making the right call. Well, today, the 25th of October, marks the anniversary of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's assuming office last year. And I thought, as I'm joined by a particularly pugnacious panel this evening, I'd take a quick look back on his tenure and ask whether he's on track to keep the job. Well, his leadership began with a strong emphasis on caution and fiscal responsibility, and whilst these remain key guiding principles, the signs certainly seem to show that he's willing to break with orthodoxy to pursue bold election-winning strategies, began with his limitation of painful net zero policies and continued with the scrapping of the northern leg of HS2. So while these are encouraging movements, the Tories have unfortunately just lost 2 by-elections. So is Rishi doing enough to motivate Conservative voters? And can he win? Kevin, you don't want him to win, but that's different. Can he win?
Well, I think I'll answer the question by saying that when I have heard from Keir Starmer and other leading shadow front benchers, they are very humble and not making any assumptions that this election is in the bag. OK? Some stonking by-elections last week. I was out for one of them in mid-Bedfordshire. Results that, you know, make you at risk electorally. But I think to be arrogant or assuming about any election win would be a mistake. That's not what Keir Starmer's about. So the answer, could Rishi Sunak win? Well, of course he could. But, you know, opinion polls are very bad. I don't think he's got an answer. I think your party's tired and run out of steam.
Kelvin, inflation's coming down, interest rates will be following, the tax burden's likely to come down as the economy grows a bit, making progress towards reducing the small boats. Actually, he's doing quite well, isn't he?
I actually think he is doing quite well, and I'm very pleased that we got a period of calm. And of course, I would quote another Labour politician to you, which of course, as your friend Harold Wilson said, a week is a long time in politics. And the truth about the matter is, you only have to look at what happened to Theresa May to know what a 14% majority advantage in the polls looks like come election day. The reality is, nobody knows what the outcome is. It's clear that Starmer, quite a good lawyer, therefore he doesn't really mind which side he bats for, to be fair. With the exception, of course, of taking on private schools. He loves doing that as his flag-waving opportunity to kick people who worry about their children's education.
He wants a fair deal for every kid, and he knows that the bigger private schools have got a balance sheet. It won't touch the side.
Well, I'm delighted they have. That means they've had some successful kids who've left money to them. So thank God for that.
It's great, and it's.
But he is a bit of a spinning top politically, isn't he? You get lots of different views.
Okay, so I'm on the channel, right? That's it. The gloves are off now, right?
Okay.
This is the channel where your colleague in Parliament, Priti Patel, cheers at Tory party conference. GBNews, well done, our friends. Of course, you lot are going to say that, all right? But you're deluded.
You lot, a bit of you-lotism.
You're in.
Right,
I'm sorry, Kelvin. You've asked for this, right? Yeah. You've asked for this. You are deluded, like with how millions of people are living out there, chaps. Right? It's honestly.
No, but this doesn't change the point that Sir Keir Starmer keeps on changing his mind.
No,
that's what we were discussing.
No, it doesn't. I mean, how can you? Why don't you talk about your record?
Well, okay, well, why don't we talk about Rishi? Why don't we talk about?
Let's go back talking about Rishi.
Let's talk about Rishi.
If he had any backbone, you would have been. You shouldn't be allowed to stand again the way you've talked about him. You call him a socialist. I mean, when he first came in, you absolutely battered him. I mean, he's weak. Otherwise,
I don't agree. I don't agree with Jacob about him being a socialist. What I do believe is that he is calm and considered, and we haven't had one of those for certainly sort of whenever it is 4 years anyway. I feel I felt very uneasy about seeing some of our Tory leaders. Now we have a guy. He's been in for a year. I suspect we're going to see some good changes. I think we're going to see stamp duty down. I hope we're going to see inheritance tax down. I hope we're going to see general taxation down. I want tax to.
After the mortgage.
Do you want stamp duty down or not?
Yeah, everybody would like stamp duty down. But
as a Conservative, want to encourage home ownership.
Yes, as does the Labour Party.
No, they don't.
Hang on.
They want to encourage council homes.
No, they don't.
They don't want people to own their own homes, because when they own their own homes, they vote Tory.
Kelvin, the Labour Party 1959 manifesto about allowing workers to buy their own homes. Labour is the party that wants to build homes.
They then tried to stop it when Margaret Thatcher did it.
No, you can talk. Your party's full of NIMBYs, OK? You're not, because you're not. You're full of NIMBYs.
Even Keir Starmer was a NIMBY when it was building in his own constituency.
Yeah, but he's
changed his mind, as he has on almost every single subject.
Listen, you can try all you want, all this stuff you can chuck around Keir Starmer. The Conservative Party has left this country in a really bad state.
What I'm saying
is that Keir Starmer is humble, right, about his prospects, and he takes nothing for granted. But how many prime ministers have we had? How is life better today than 13 years ago?
Well, we dealt with the financial crisis that was left by the Labour Party that spent all the money. We dealt with COVID and got the economy through that.
COVID, 7.2 billion quid of our cash that's gone. We don't know where it is.
Do you honestly think that a Labour administration would handle money better than a Conservative one?
100%.
You honestly, Kevin,
you think Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister would have handled COVID better and spent money better?
Well, how could it have been any worse?
Because he was the person who would have won in 2019.
Let's bring Corbyn in. Keir Starmer is the candidate on the ballot sheet. Okay. Let's go back to why Rishi's brilliant. Why is Rishi great?
Keir Starmer backed Jeremy Corbyn, didn't he?
Never mind.
But it's quite important because
he held his hand.
Is that all you've got to talk about? Why is Rishi a great Prime Minister? stuff.
Rishi, I think, as Kelvin has been saying, he's dealing with things calmly. He's getting on with things. Inflation is coming down. That will help interest rates go down. He's made big decisions. Cutting back on the green propaganda is really sensible. Will make people's lives easier and cheaper. Will help people heat their homes without being afraid. Will help them to drive around and use their cars. This is really sensible bread and butter politics.
It's going to be a narrow-run thing. Let's be honest about it. 20-odd%. Some of these by-election results are eye-watering. But come the day, I don't know that he can do enough to get across the line. But what I do know is that, in a strange way, I think Corbyn would actually, strangely, have been a better candidate for the way people feel right now than they think they're electing left-wing Tory.
No.
Former editor of The Sun endorses Jeremy Corbyn. You heard it here first. Thanks to my panel. They were on good form this evening, weren't they? Quite feisty. Coming up next, was Henry V, His late Majesty, an uncivilised warmonger? And don't go anywhere, just make a cup of tea, actually coffee. I much prefer it. A new study says it will fight off frailty and we'll all live forever.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like? I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GBNews.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows,
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your mail mogs. Penelope, Rishi Sunak is definitely not a cry God for Harry, Henry V character, nor is he as comatose as Henry VI. So you're going, Penelope, for neither. Steve, Sunak will be remembered as Richard III. Oh dear. Malcolm, Rishi is neither Henry V nor Henry VI, but unfortunately Rishi the last. Canute had more chance of turning... no, Canute didn't try to turn back the tide. He told people that as king he didn't have that power, so correct that historic misrepresentation. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhood cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. That's how Shakespeare summarised the events of the 25th of October, 1415, the day England was triumphant at the Battle of Agincourt, which fell, of course, on St. Crispin's Day, 608 years on from this historic victory. This St. Crispin's Day, St. Crispin was the patron saint, is the patron saint of cobblers and leather workers, among others, happens to coincide with the anniversary of Rishi Sunak becoming Prime Minister. And not that long ago, the comedian David Mitchell argued in a new book that Henry V, our celebrated monarch who won this great victory, was actually an uncivilised warmonger. Reflecting on our leaders through the lens of history is an ever-fruitful activity. So can we, should we, must we compare Rishi Sunak to Henry V, or is our Prime Minister closer to another monarch from history? Well, with me now to delve into these questions is the historian-writer Oliver Webb-Carter. So, first of all, this allegation that Henry V was a terrible warmonger is very unfair, isn't it? That medieval kings fought wars because if they didn't, they were defeated and ousted.
Well, much as I don't like disagreeing with people who've written well-regarded history books, as David Mitchell has, to judge the past by the present, I think it's probably not the best thing to do, but I'm sure David has done that in order to sell a few more of his very good book. So when it comes to Henry V, we have to remember that we're talking about the 100 Years' War here, England and France. I think if one looks at the statistics in the history of England since 1066, we've been at war with France for almost 20% of the time. So whilst it wasn't normality to be fighting France, it certainly wasn't unusual. And so the victory at Agincourt was not a victory of a warmonger over a peace-loving France. It was very much a battle between two monarchs when it really comes down to the most basic point of power.
And two monarchs who would have been squabbling in different areas otherwise. So if Henry V hadn't been in France, the King of France would have been stirring things up in Scotland, and indeed Henry V himself, as Prince of Wales, has settled a dispute in Wales. So the idea that it would all have been peace and love if Henry V hadn't gone over and besieged Harfleur and then won at Agincourt is ridiculous.
Yes, the medieval period, medieval historians get very upset when you start talking about the period as sort of all blood and guts. But then one looks at the number of battles that took place. There was certainly warfare was almost normality, and life as a serf or a peasant in the period would often have involved being disrupted by armies that needed to be fed and things like that. So I don't think it's too harsh a description of the medieval period to describe it as rather warlike.
But Henry V is actually quite an important domestic ruler, even though he's out of the country quite a bit. So he rebases the currency, which, as with Rishi Sunak dealing with inflation, to get this comparison in, is taking difficult long-term decisions that make conditions quite hard whilst you're doing it. He's a great advocate of law and order, that there was a view that under his father there'd been too much disorder. He enforces unity on the nobility in quite a strict way, and indeed threatens them with execution if they don't behave. There's a lot of him that is remarkably modern as a monarch trying to ensure a stable country by sound government.
Well, I would always find it's always a little difficult to find those direct comparisons, and Rishi Sunak, and I must confess, Rishi Sunak and Henry V, that really struck me particularly. So I'm a little surprised at that.
It's the economic policy that I'm interested in, that actually Rishi Sunak is doing things that Henry V would have been sympathetic to if he were alive today in terms of ensuring stability of the currency through dealing with inflation, and Henry V rebased the currency.
I suspect Henry V might have recognised in... he would have struggled to recognise the form of government, but but Rishi Sunak, being a sound economic administrator, again, I'm not convinced that Prime Minister Sunak's achievements are quite at the level of Henry V's.
And in the charisma terms, probably Boris Johnson is a more Henry V character than Rishi Sunak, because Henry V was clearly throughout his life a big figure, and if you look at what's going on in France, when he's there leading the troops, they win. As soon as he's back in England, we start losing.
Well, I'm not convinced again that Boris Johnson certainly is Boris Johnson is again not a name that would spring to mind when thinking of Henry V.
But you can imagine him making a great speech before leading troops into battle, can't you? And saying, people in our bed would hold their manhood sheep, they were not with us here on St Crispin's Day. That's a Boris line, isn't it?
Well, you have to remember those weren't the words of Henry V, they were the words of Shakespeare.
So what you're really saying is Henry V had a very good speechwriter.
Yeah, a speechwriter who was writing many years after he died. Yes, indeed.
Yes. Excellent. Look, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. I hope you'll come back to discuss history with us more often. And finally, caffeine. Addicts like me rejoice. New research has found that drinking 4 cups of tea or coffee per day could reduce the odds of becoming physically frail later on in life. So if you're quaffing good, honest Nescafe, I've had a predilection for Alta Rica since I was a schoolboy, or if you prefer a nice cup of tea in middle age, keep going. You may just be warding off the frailty that can otherwise come to us in later years. I think I drink so much that I will live forever. Though that's a thought in itself. Anyway, thank you very much. That's all from me. Up next is Patrick Christys. Patrick, you're going to have a nice cup of coffee this evening?
I absolutely am. You'll come as no surprise that this is my 10th of the day, but there we go. OK, I've got a heck of a lot on. I am asking whether or not Winston Churchill will be turning in his grave looking at Britain today as we barricade the cenotaph, preparing for yet more protests on the streets. I've got a clash as well, 2 big guests, including Charlie Mullins, on whether or not it's right to strip Carol Vorderman of her honorary RAF titles. Lee Anderson joins me, Jim Davidson joins me. We look at Labour ripping itself apart over that old Israel-Gaza issue. All to play for. I'll see you 9 till 11.
Well, that's great. I hope your plumbing's all in good order for that great countdown. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jake Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I hear from my children who are in Somerset for half-term that the weather there is absolutely beautiful.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Some clear spells out there first overnight, but where we see the clear spells, we also see some mist and fog developing, and quite a number of showers will arrive in many places by dawn. A large area of low pressure to the west of the UK is swinging various weather fronts our way over the next few days, and in between the fronts we'll see some clear spells, but also some showers. A gap in between the systems across northern England into the Midlands, East Anglia overnight could lead to some fog patches by dawn. Otherwise, a lot of cloud on the map as we begin Thursday. That means a mild start, but it also means a bit of a gloomy start. There'll be showers or longer spells of rain across many parts of the country, potential for some heavy rain around the south coast, and some persistent rain setting up across the north and east of Scotland with gales for Shetland and Orkney. Now, because of the increasingly persistent rain across eastern Scotland, there's a rain warning in force. It's not going to be as wet as it was last week, but any additional rainfall, of course, could cause some issues. Elsewhere, it's showers and some frequent heavy downpours in places. They'll continue into Friday across Northern Ireland, Western England, Wales, with some thunder and hail thrown in as well. More persistent rain continues across central and eastern Scotland, the north and east of England as well. And more unsettled weather on the way for Saturday and Sunday, with low pressure continuing to dominate.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these 3.
Oh! No, thank you. My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News. We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like? I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GBNews.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 9 o'clock, I'm Patrick Christie's, and this is GB News Tonight. And after an almighty showdown with Muslim MPs today over his stance on the Israel-Hamas war, is Keir Starmer finally losing control of the unruly Labour Party? That's the big debate with my panel. Joining me this evening are Christine Hamilton, Adam Brooks and Matthew Larzer. Stellar stuff, you love to see it. But before that, amid the shocking rise of anti-Semitism on our streets, would the great Winston Churchill now be turning in his grave at the erosion of British values? I'll deliver my patriotic perspective. That's next. Plus, comedy legend and British Forces ambassador Jim Davidson rages at police for building barricades at the Cenotaph after a spate of those pro-Palestine protests. What's this country coming to, eh? But also on the way, BBC Director General Tim Davie has just finished being grilled by the 1922 committee over the corporation's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war, amongst other things.